Good morning. My name is Alec Beard, and I'd like to take the time this morning to walk you through a short lecture on the concept of evangelism. Evangelism is a fundamental part of who we are as believers because we believe that we have been given a core message, a life-changing message, and are called to go forth and share that message. So the how and why of evangelism are very important for us today as we seek to follow Christ. Now, thankfully, there are lots of resources that are produced on the concept of evangelism, and one such resource that I'd like to look at today is the book by Robert Coleman called The Master Plan of Evangelism. Now, in this resource, Coleman looks at the Master himself, Jesus, and identifies 8 fundamental principles that he believes were effective for Jesus' ministry and evangelism. And what I'd like to do today is I'd like to walk through each individual principle and share some highlights that stuck out to me as I read this book and internalized it and applied it to my own pursuit of evangelism and ministry. The first principle that Coleman identifies is the idea of selection. Now, what stuck out to me about this principle is that Jesus is intentional in the followers that he selects. He identifies a willingness to learn from these disciples. He identifies a commitment, a sense of commitment to what he's calling them to. And he identifies, I believe, a really fundamental part of who they were was that they saw something in Jesus that was worth following. And, Jesus's early ministry may not have been considered a success by, modern metrics that we use today to measure success. But if you look at how the early years of Jesus's ministry played out, they were fundamental in shaping the character and heart of these men who would later down the road be fundamental in building the church, in creating disciples, and in sharing the gospel. Coleman notes on this point, I think, is really important, that though Jesus did what he could do for the multitudes, he had to devote himself primarily to a few men rather than the masses, so that the masses could at last be saved. This was the genius in his strategy. So as we think about evangelism and leadership today, it's fundamental for us to identify and select key followers who we think will join us on this mission. The second principle is association. Now, when we think of association, we tend to think of things that are related to one another. The National Basketball Association is a group of teams conjoined and merged for one purpose. However, in the ministry of Jesus, association with his disciples was more. It was more about proximity. Jesus was associated with his disciples in that he spent a frequent amount of intimate time with them. And he did this to teach them and to know them on a deep, deep level. I think this makes sense when we think about the fact that the people we know best are the people that we spend the most time with. An association is built through consistent time, allowing us to follow up on important matters that we discuss, and association is driven through consistency. The church, on its own, we engage in association through practicing continual worship. Coleman notes on this point, which I think is really profound, that it's important here to observe that the emergence of the church principle around Jesus, whereby one believer was brought into fellowship with all the others, was the practice in a larger dimension of the same thing that he was doing with the 12. So when Jesus practicing proximity and association with his disciples plays out in the way that we relate to each other as the church today. The third principle is consecration. Now, while this principle may sound a bit different, its basic premise, according to Coleman, is that Jesus expected obedience of those who followed him. Throughout his ministry, Jesus was quick to present the challenges of following him. He did not shy from proclaiming the cost that was required of following Jesus. And I think that we, as we seek to evangelize and disciple today, should be equally as focused on sharing the cost of Jesus. In John 5:30, where Jesus says, "I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me," Jesus is identifying that he is not about his own will. He's about the Father's will. And so for us, Coleman notes that the cross was the crowning climax of Jesus' commitment to do the will of God. And it forever showed that obedience could not be compromised. It was always a commitment unto death. So as we seek to evangelize and lead our followers, we have to present to them the reality of the cost of following Jesus. The fourth principle that Coleman identifies is impartation. Now, all this means is that Jesus gave himself to his disciples. And we see that in his service to them, in his sacrifice of his own life, and then through the promise and reception of the Holy Spirit. So as we think about our ministry today and we think about evangelizing, we cannot separate that from the work of the Holy Spirit. Coleman really notes an important aspect of this when he says Jesus was God in revelation, but the Spirit is God in operation. In light of this, evangelism was not to be interpreted as a human undertaking, but as a divine project that had been going on from the beginning and would continue until God's purpose was fulfilled. We are engaging in the Spirit's work as we seek to evangelize, as we seek to lead our followers. And so as we continue to do that, we must be a people that are reliant upon the Spirit, that are engaged with the Spirit, and that are in consistent and deep communion with the Spirit. The fifth principle that Coleman identifies is demonstration. Now, in John 13:15, Jesus says, I have given you an example. And I think this short yet profound message is really important as we seek to evangelize. Jesus led by example. He was consistently showing himself to his disciples in a variety of different ways. And as we seek to evangelize and lead those who are following us, we have to seek to lead by example. Jesus used the things around his disciples to communicate with them constantly. He used metaphors, parables, and imagery that was made up of cultural aspects that they would have been very familiar with. So as we seek to lead others and evangelize others, we too should engage in the world around us that is familiar and use and illustrate and kind of use those things to point them back to Jesus and back to the message that God is seeking to share with them. As Christian leaders, modeling our lives after Jesus is one of our most effective methods or principles that we can use in evangelism and leadership development. The sixth principle that Coleman identifies is delegation. And all that means is that Jesus gave his disciples work to do. And I think this is really important because when we think about Jesus and his disciples, they didn't just sit around and talk. They worked. And when Jesus saw maturity and growth in his disciples, he naturally progressed to a place where he gave them responsibilities and tasks to go perform. And this was really fundamental in their working relationship because as they came back and they told Jesus what happened, he was able to use those real life experiences to continue to develop and coach them to prepare them for the future of ministry that they would engage in after he ascended back into heaven. So as we think about the apostles and the church and how it's built in the first century, much of that is derived from the way that Jesus used that work that he gave his disciples, and he engaged them with it and taught them in identified ways that they can continue to grow and become more effective at evangelizing, at discipling, at sharing the truth, and building the church. Coleman notes in this section that Jesus never sent his followers out alone. They are always going out together. And I think this is important that as we realize that as we evangelize others, we should not then seek to turn them out alone. We should go with them or send others with them so that they are in constant fellowship with others. The seventh principle that Coleman identifies is supervision. Now, this principle plays off the previous one, and while Jesus gave his followers tasks to accomplish, he was always checking in on them regularly to ensure that they were doing a good job, that they were, learning from what they were experiencing, and he was using those moments to continue to teach them. And by engaging in supervision, Jesus was able to identify certain aspects of his followers' character, which still needed transformation and growth before they were ready for the future task of building the church. Coleman notes the importance of this principle, saying, it is thus crucial that those engaging in the work of evangelism have personal supervision and guidance until such time as they are mature enough to carry it alone. So as we evangelize and develop leaders, we want to ensure that we are supervising them and we are drawing close to them so that we can engage in their experiences and help them learn and grow to prepare them for a more effective future ministry. The eighth and final principle is reproduction. Now, this is the fundamental aspect of, I think, Coleman's book and Jesus' message, in that as we as disciples go out and share the gospel, the goal is to reproduce. There is many metaphors used by Jesus in his parables and his teachings that deal with fruit and producing fruit. Again, coming from an agrarian society, Jesus is using those images and those metaphors that the disciples would have recognized, and in that, he is calling us to reproduce fruit in ourselves. As we seek to lead and evangelize others, we are reproducing ourselves, whereas we were reproduced from someone who poured into us, going all the way back to the message and the way that Jesus poured into his disciples so that they could in turn and pour out to others. So as we seek to evangelize and as we seek to do ministry, our goal is to reproduce the image of Jesus through commitment, through modeling what it looks like to serve him and follow him, and through encouraging others to live lives of obedience to him. And all these principles play together in a really balanced, beautiful way that should lead to the process of reproduction. Reproduction is a great litmus test for us as we consider how effective our evangelism or our ministry is, and we can ask ourselves, are we producing more disciples? Coleman notes a very profound statement in this section where he says, a barren Christian is a contradiction. A tree is known by its fruit. And by this, I think we can take and internalize that as we move forward in our ministry and as we move forward in discipleship and evangelism, our goal is to reproduce more disciples of Jesus. And as we do that, and we see that reproduction taking place, we can give glory to Jesus and we can honor God and we can say, hey, we're on the right track. And from there, we can continue to grow and continue to share our experiences with one another as Jesus did with his disciples, so that we can continue to produce more and more effective disciples for Jesus Christ. Thanks for taking the time to listen today, and I encourage you to go read The Master Plan of Evangelism by Robert Coleman yourself and learn from it and continue to seek to make more and more disciples of Jesus Christ.